So we were earlier talking about supply and demand, and I think the next step in our discussion is to look at two things. Number one is sensitivity in supply and demand, and the second is looking at the dynamics of supply and demand. So with sensitivity, let me start with demand. And again, as always, the price is graphed here and the quantity over here. And the question is, when I change my price, the quantity people demanded, the quantity that people will demand will change. The question is how much? It's certainly possible that you take a product like a certain brand of breakfast cereal, a certain brand of toothpaste, and you say, if I raise the price 10%, how much business will I lose? And the answer is probably 30 or 40%. And then you can take another product like gasoline, or if you prefer heroin, and ask, if I raise the price 10%, how much less will people buy? And the answer is probably about 1%. So in the first case, people respond in a very sensitive way, and in the second, people are much less sensitive. People are inelastic or insensitive to the price. It doesn't mean that they don't respond, it just means that they don't respond very much. So in the first case, we've got elastic demand, and it looks more or less like this. Fairly flat. And that means that a small change in price relates to a big change in quantity. So if I raise or lower the price just a little bit, the change in quantity is going to be huge compared to the small price change. Examples of things that are elastic in their demand are things that have lots of close substitutes. So a particular brand of shirt. If you go to buy a fine Hawaiian shirt, there's lots of different brands. And if one brand alone changes its price, there's a lot of other Hawaiian shirts you could buy, which is one of another 100 similar but not identical brands. A particular bottle of wine. If you go to a grocery store that sells lots of wine, there might be 100 different brands. And if 99 have their price stay the same, but one of them lowers or raises its price, people will be very elastic in their response. So availability of substitutes is important, and also the percentage of your income that you spend on that product is important. If it's something that you spend half your money on, then a small price change might relate to a large change in quantity. A good example of this is food. If you go to the United States, you raise or lower the price of food, people will buy a little bit less or a little bit more. If you go to India, and you raise or lower the price of food, then people will, when the price is lower, actually buy a lot more because they're hungry on average. Whereas in the US, we spend maybe 5 or 10% of our income on food. In a country that's not as wealthy, they might spend as much as 50 or 60% of their income on food, which means that you're much more responsive to price change. The contrasting perspective is inelastic demand, which tends to look like this. Gasoline, of course, is the first example. Cigarettes. If you raise the price of cigarettes by 10%, people smoke about 4% less, maybe 3% less. So again, you respond, the quantity demanded changes, but it's small compared to the magnitude of the price change. So with a big change in price, you get a small change in quantity. So inelastic demand is something like that. You can raise the price a lot and you only lose a few customers, or your existing customers just buy a little bit less. Right? You smoke 12 packs a week instead of 13 or 14 is typically what happens. With gasoline, when you raise the price, it's not like people just park their car and walk the rest of the way. but you might take fewer trips. You might walk for shorter distances. In the long run, over time, elasticity will change. Eventually, you'll buy a more fuel-efficient car. When your Humvee breaks down, you won't buy another one. You'll buy a Toyota Prius. You'll move closer to where you work eventually if the price of gasoline gets very high and stays high. So in the short run, people are very inelastic, but the sensitivity to price change for gasoline actually increases over time. If the price of gas goes up a lot and stays high, eventually as a consumer my behavior changes as a response to that price. So that's sort of how elasticity looks.